What was your aha moment? And that's different. Is that different than the eureka moment? Or is it this tantamount to the same thing?
They are the same thing.
So what was it for you? Because you spent 22 years at the Wall Street Journal, and then you left and had, a number of high profile jobs. Now here you are writing books. Was there something that, when retrospect, you go back and you saw yourself searching?
So this is what's so interesting about this process is when I talk to people, even the most extreme transitions, like the telephone repairman to shoe designer, they will say, well, it wasn't really a reinvention. It was more just a fuller expression of who I really am, right? Like the shoe designer will integrate like industrial parts into his shoe designs. Like he's like, I use everything. James Patterson said, I use everything from advertising in terms of connecting with an audience and even designing book covers and choosing typefaces. And I feel the same way in my own career. My self-identity, so to speak, is journalist. And that has not changed. So to the outside, so many of the people I talk to looks like a 180, but in fact, they don't see it that way. There's a wonderful woman I interviewed named Catherine Finney, who started as a Yale-trained epidemiologist and in her spare time wrote like a blog about cheap fashion. She became famous as the budget fashionista and then again pivoted, and now she is an investor in Black-owned technology companies and basically an advisor to Black-owned startups. Now, I cannot imagine 3 different careers that sound more different than that. But when I asked her about her pivot, she's like, what pivot? She's like, every stage was sort of a natural progression to the next. And I think that's really a key. It's one of the keys. I have several strategies that I outline in the book for successful transitions. And that is definitely one of them is that, I can go through several if you
Well,
like.
I want to talk about the tactics. I guess one thing that struck me as I was thinking about this book a little bit is people can reinvent themselves for the better, and that's the aspiration and the inspiration of the book. But we also see examples where people become nastier, people become worse versions of themselves. I would, in all honesty, I would put Donald Trump in that category, from when I knew him as a real estate developer to, a politician. I think we have multiple examples of politicians throughout history who reinvented themselves as something worse. Now obviously it's the same tactics perhaps, and it's a very different book you'd be writing, but have you gleaned anything from that? Because I'm especially, there's this angst, almost existential angst, and a lot of unhappiness. And it seems like people sometimes are reinventing themselves, but they're not quite happy with the results, or they're not getting where they want to go. Sure.
Well, I think those are 2 different issues. So
2 different issues. Let's start with the negative reinvention. You're absolutely right. So
I also covered Donald Trump when I was a real estate reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And I think for some of those guys, it is what I just said. It's a fuller expression of who they actually are. It's just coming out. But in terms of people who are sort of disappointed, right? Like, I'm not sure where I'm going. They're probably still on that journey. I think, there are several strategies for success, but there's also strategies for understanding like when to stop. Like if you're just going down the wrong road, right? So, and I think it'd be worth hitting on a few of these. The first is, let me talk about like the successful transformers who I spoke to in every aspect of life, not just career, but just in terms of changing their life. And the first step for almost all of these people is what I call the move before you move, right? The key is that you don't just like throw up your hands and say, I quit. I quit. I don't want to be a journalist. I want to be a ballerina, right? Like you don't do that.
Right.
Right. Everybody I spoke to had this very gradual, iterative process. And again, it mostly started before they realized that it started, right? So it's this iterative process. And for people who change careers, it could be just a hobby, a side hustle. It could just be a random interest that is sort of taking you in this direction without necessarily having a goal in mind. So that is really key. There's another really important factor for so many of the people I talk to, and I call it the expert companion. So I'm borrowing this phrase, expert companion. It is an actual psychological phrase from trauma psychology, when they talk with people who have great trauma and manage to go beyond and have what's called post-traumatic growth, as in find better things.
That's not a term you hear
trauma.
very often. Post-traumatic growth.
But this expert companion is someone who helps them to go beyond the trauma. What the expert companion is in your own life, because I think we all need one, it is the person who can see you objectively, who can reflect back to you what are your strengths, what are your what's the progress you have made that you don't even realize, because very often the things that we are best at are innate. We discount them, or we don't even recognize them. And so if you are making this kind of transition, it's really helpful to talk to someone who knows you. And it could be a coach, but it could just be like a family member, a friend, or a colleague who can tell you, hey, when I see you, these are the strengths I see. These are the things. And it helps you to clarify like where you're actually good at, as opposed to whatever fantasy you might have in your head.
Well, no, it's a good point, because when I speak to a lot of leaders and I ask who has a coach, most hands go up in a room. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a friend that you lean on. It could be somebody that you hire whose job it is to do that. So you don't, have to go seeking a friend who's going to play that role necessarily.
Exactly. And another thing that most of these people had in common was imagining what are called possible selves. It's, again, another psychological term, but it applies to all of us. The idea of possible selves is imagining what I could be or what I might be. And you have to think through it. It is the very first step of actually making that leap. But it's not enough to just cogitate and think in your own head. Again, this is something you need to share with someone else. You need to write it down. All the research shows, like, if you write this down and share it, you're far more likely to reach your goal than if you just kind of keep mulling in your head. And then one other really important strategy that we sort of know, but we very often don't do, which is really work those weak ties and dormant ties. So weak ties are the people who you don't know that well or have a tangential relation to. Like, let's say I want to work at Google. I don't know anybody there, but I know that my husband's sister-in-law's brother worked at Google.
Yeah.
Right? That's your weak tie. The dormant ties are really interesting. Those are the people you've lost touch with, right? So it could be your old college classmate or anyone who you've kind of a childhood friend, somebody you've lost touch with. What we find in the research is that when you reach out to those weak or dormant ties, they are far, far, far more likely to give you the advice you need and to give you the leads you need to find a new job. LinkedIn actually recently crunched the numbers on its own members and found the majority of them had found new jobs because of these weak or dormant ties, not from their inner circle. The inner circle, we all know the same thing, and you're sort of in a bubble. So you got to get outside the bubble.